Welcome to another edition of the Corner Booth Podcast here from the Snowden Deli. I'm Aaron Rand from CJD along with Bill Brownstein of the Montreal Gazette and our special guest today, the Honorable Marc Miller, the Federal Minister of Immigration, Citizenship and Refugees. Thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks, Bill.
If I had known that ministers could come dressed this
yes,
way,
we
I
would
have
be
not worn a jacket and neither would
we
Bill.
were dressing up for you.
Yeah.
Sorry to disappoint.
That's okay.
It's okay. Next time.
You're just coming back, did you tell me, from a run on the mountain?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now you're.
It was a gorgeous. Well, I'm 50 something, so I do have to start worrying about my knees. But it's great. It actually, I don't do it to. I do it to get in shape, but to clear your brain in the morning.
Good for you.
Yeah.
Yes, you've got a lot of chance to have that much free
Now
time
you're
to
ready
do
to
this
dive
stuff.
into Delhi. Very nice. Yeah.
This is what. Yeah. Now I'm going to ruin the whole 7-kilometer run.
You get to take it all home, by the way. That's the exciting part of being on the Corner
I thought the
Booth.
chopped liver was because I was coming here, and that's how I feel sometimes.
Yeah, we have it out for every politician. Just so
You
know.
really feel like chopped liver?
What's that?
Why would you
No,
feel
no.
like chopped liver?
I actually, Bill, it seems odd because just because of the pressure that an immigration minister
Pressure, really?
has. But I love what I do.
Yeah.
I truly love what I do. It's a unique opportunity to serve your country and to help shape the face of the future of the country in a way that you wouldn't have in private practice. I was a mergers and acquisitions lawyer. Great, challenging job, but politics, you can live a lifetime in a week. Sometimes good, sometimes bad, but
This week particularly.
the last couple of weeks have been
Yeah.
a lot. But I love what I do. I really love what I do, and I love serving Canadians.
So let me go back. Immigration as a file. I don't want to say it was a pretty sleepy file 10 years ago, but we weren't talking about it in the news every other day as we are now.
Every other day, every day.
There's a recent poll, and I think the number is concern over immigration has quadrupled over the last 4 years, and that's across the country. You're the minister now. I can't imagine you could have seen this coming 3 or 4 years ago. So given the fact that it's now become such a serious issue, it's obviously going to be a political issue come the next election. There are a lot of people criticizing the Liberal government for having basically opened the floodgates and now trying to close them, after the horses left the barn, so to speak. What's your answer to that? I mean, this is policy that just seemed to come out of nowhere. Is this pandemic related? How did this all happen?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not a narrative that has sprung up. I don't want to minimize it either because there is concern. We did a strategic review in my department. I've been the minister for a year, so again, I'm still learning, but have had to take a number of decisions that are important to what the shape of immigration is in the country for both permanent residents and temporary residents. But we've had all 3 elections that have had heavy immigration themes to them. Recall in 2015, the war in Syria and the horrible images of Ellen Kurdi, that young child washed up on the shores of Europe. That shaped a number of the debates in the election. The narrative over dual citizenship and terrorism, the evacuation of Kabul in the last election, which dominated the first 2 weeks of the election, as well as what's the aggression of the Russian aggression in Ukraine. So these have been hot topics, and we're not immune to what we're seeing to the south of the border, what we see on Fox News, by U.S. politicians, what we see in Europe. But we have been lucky as a country to be able to have a consensus on immigration where you don't, and there's people that are flirting with and playing footsie with some extremist views, but there's no outwardly anti-immigrant major party in Canada, which I think is something we should be proud of.
You're talking
still.
federally.
Federally. There are, and the strategic review that my department did, which sounds like a bureaucratic turn of phrase for most people, but it did show that Canadians are still positive about immigration. I think the polls still show that, but they don't want an immigration system that's out of control or that is going in a direction that doesn't make sense. And if we back up a second, and I don't want to sort of take all the air out of the room, but the IMF, Bank of Canada, other economists have clearly said that immigration has been importantly responsible for avoiding 2 recessions. So that's a good starting point. Now, as the federal government that has increased immigration, we do bear some responsibility for the good and the bad of that. And I think we're at a point in time where we have to reflect on the growth that's occurred and whether that's a growth that's sustainable when you talk about issues of integration, when you talk about the job market and the important jobs that they fill. All our gross domestic product has been driven largely by immigration. But is that the right type of growth? Is that what Canadians want to see? And how do we do this in a way that makes sense while maintaining a consensus that is under
Well,
threat?
to your
Let's be
point
honest
about growth being sustainable, I think it's pretty clear. At least most Canadians seem to think it's not. It's really not the way it is now. We keep hearing, you know the drill. It's
Right.
about housing. It's about jobs. It's about social services that have to be offered to these people, and it isn't sustainable.
No,
and I guess to a point you recognize that because there have been sort of restrictions put in place.
Yeah, I mean, we see there's sort of two themes that we can break. The permanent residents of Canada that we've increased the numbers on that will become Canadian citizens, and people that are here temporarily. Both those categories have seen growth, and they do play into each other, and they were important to avoiding the recession, but in some areas there has been an overheating. And take the international student file, for example.
Right.
You see students coming to this country, sometimes under the false promise that they can become permanent residents. They get offered sham degrees by institutions, largely in Ontario and British Columbia. So they're out $100,000 and they end up driving an Uber or slinging pizzas. That's not the type of international visa program that what I administer was intended to do in the first place. Now, the federal government doesn't get a dollar from that. The Ontario and BC governments do, provincial governments do, but importantly, institutions do as well, whether that's U of T or Dr. Nick's upstairs Hollywood Medical School
Right.
in God knows where. So and that's a joke, but those fly-by-night operations do exist, and they need to shut down. But there's been a failure of provincial authorities
Right.
to regulate things within their.
Which is a whole other element to your job, which is really what captures so much of the
pushing
attention
in
here.
So when you look at the temporary resident graphic, half of it is occupied by international students and the postgraduate work permits that come with them. Quebec's a bit of a different animal, as it always is, because it has much more control over this. But when you look at all of Canada, that's an area where I've had to cut back, and it's bearing fruit. Do we have to do more? Do we have to look at this in a more surgical way? That's the question that I need to pose in the next couple of months. But it is actually showing that in some areas we are bringing rental prices down. Now, immigrants aren't responsible for everything. No one's going to credit them for bringing down the interest rates like we've seen recently. But there are low immigration economies that have the same affordability challenge as us. The question is looking at what that volume does in immigration and what the impact is, but not blaming everything on immigrants, because it's a false debate and it's usually weaponized for political purposes.
Well, you bring up the issue of international students, which is very touchy in Quebec, as you know, and I guess you find yourself in a kind of strange position there, because, as you know, in terms of what the provincial government wants to cut back on people coming here, international students, American students, and so on, it kind of makes it difficult on a certain level, I would think.
Yeah, Bill, and I think the interesting thing that has been spoken less about is that Quebec generally has been responsible about its administration, in terms of volume, has been responsible for the administration of the international student program. They don't have the problems that Ontario and BC have. Unfairly, I think a number of international students and the institutions that support them, like McGill, Concordia, Bishops, have been accused of anglicizing Montreal, and international students are being pointed at that. They're a huge source of wealth, intellectual wealth, economic wealth for the city, and I think make it the pride of Canada in terms of its institutional heft, educational heft that it has. So there's that political debate that I think is unfortunate. But when you look at the programs themselves, Quebec has generally been responsible. There are certain institutions that have not necessarily had the best practices, and you see that in the students that present refugee claims. It doesn't make sense that a student would come to Canada and claim refugee status after a year. They do that for a variety of reasons, but sometimes because if they get refugee status, it would bring down their tuition rates. So there's some responsibility in recruiting that institutions need to assume. But what we can't get into is a political debate about an invasion of international students that are suddenly diluting the city in some form or way, because I think they're a great wealth to the city. But again, this all has to be done responsibly and hopefully without sort of the political
What kind of
weaponization.
communication do you have with the province on a subject like this?
We're quite clear on what our views are on them. When we talk about well, when we talk about temporary, and this is why I said Quebec's a bit of a different animal, because for about 30 years, the Quebec-Canada Accord, which under our government has seen to transfer about $5.2 billion since 2015 to Quebec to administer their immigration system, including francisation, our common language, which is very, very important, has been one that is unique compared to other provinces. Other provinces look at that and are very jealous about it. There's a reason for doing it, because Quebec is a nation. Quebec, in French as a common language, is important, and that accord has made immigration in Quebec much more French in nature. There's some real successes there that I think we don't celebrate enough. That gives them a lot of leverage over almost entirely their permanent resident numbers, and about 50% or more of their temporary residents. So the responsibility actually lies in their court. Will help them if it makes sense. But when it comes to international students, they issue, with respect to every single international student, a certificat d'acceptation du Québec, not issued by Canada, issued by Quebec, and those people have to fulfill a number of criteria. So it's their relationship with McGill, their relationship with Concordia, their relationship with bishops, their relationships with the Université de Montréal and UQAM. When you talk about Montreal, that you have to point to. I think what's important when we do that is not to weaponize the issue to make this about our national identity. These students are a huge source of pride to the city, a city that really demarcates itself internationally.
And they bring in economic benefits to boot.
Economic benefits. These people will go into some of them, some of the best jobs that are needed in Canada and in Quebec, and do at times have a pathway to permanent residency. So you don't want to throw, even if you identify a problem, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yet at the same time, living in Quebec, everything becomes political at some point, right? I mean, the issue of Quebec saying, and this is sort of a recurring theme, at least for the Premier, look, we simply are not given enough money by the federal government to deal with all the people we have to take in here. I think the last number was $750 million. Beyond money, is that the necessary part of the equation that Quebec doesn't understand, or why is the federal government just writing checks to the province to say, here, make sure these people can get whatever social services they need, and that's the end of it?
I mean, you see every premier's meeting, there's the hijacking of the federal government every time they have a meeting, and they will come out with their litany of demands of the federal government, largely within their own jurisdiction. But at the end of the day, is cut us the checks, don't ask us any questions, we'll move on, and then they'll blame us again when people don't get the health care they need, or the investments don't bear fruit. $5.2 billion in the last 8-9 years, specifically under the Quebec-Canada Accord, is not nothing. Quebecers are in right to ask what has been done with that money. There have been reports that say that not all that money has been invested in the areas where it should have been.
Wow, that's unusual.
But at the same time, there are things that money can't buy. Pressure on the healthcare system, for which we need immigrants. We cannot fill those jobs without a lot of the service jobs in healthcare without immigrants. Pressure on the educational system are very real things. It just, you can't entirely attribute them to the influx of immigrants. The lack of teachers across Canada and Quebec, with respect to French teachers in particular, is something that has been around for years, and it has nothing to do with the sudden rise in permanent residency levels. So properly attributing and identifying what the cause is important, because then you can't fix it if you don't properly identify the cause in the first place.
I'm wondering too, so now you're going from, I don't want to say it's been contentious, I don't think it has, your relationship in Quebec with Christine Frechette when she was immigration minister. Now that's changed, and suddenly your new point person on this is Jean-François Roberge, who's the language minister, who is the same minister who said he hears too much English spoken in downtown Montreal. He's now in charge of immigration. What sort of a problem does that pose for you?
One, I don't know. I had a great, so I guess the understory to this is Christine Frechette and I had a good working relationship. She's someone that works hard. We have different philosophical points of view and perspectives, and sometimes I felt, despite her best efforts, that a lot of what she had to say was layered over by a message coming from the Premier's office. But we had a good working relationship, and she's someone that works hard, so I respect her. We were sort of chatting by text this morning about the next steps forward. And so I think Roberge, I don't know Jean-François that well. We're going to actually have lunch today, so we'll see about that. But you have to presume good faith in politics, as much as you can't be naive, but we got to give the guy a chance. I hope he works as hard as her. But he's a guy I got to work with, and I got to work with a lot of premiers and a lot of people whose political philosophies I don't agree with. There are some things we do agree about, which is the importance of French in Quebec. But in my view, we can do that without denying people's rights, and that's something that I'm not afraid to stand up for. I've told them as much in our negotiation sessions over the famous $750 million that they got in compensation for some of the investments they've made for asylum seekers. So that'll continue, and that relationship I think will be one that I'll be watching, because I've had a couple of negotiation sessions with the Marin, but I don't know him.
Suffice to
I
say,
can only judge from what I've read.
he will be a little more strident than the previous minister. Madame
Well, I'll trust you guys on that, but I got to
good
give these guys the benefit of the doubt, and I got to work with the cards that are dealt with.
The Corner Booth podcast is brought to you in part by the Snowden Delicatessen, where we are. 75 years in business, the hub of Montreal's greatest smoked meat, plus Carnotzel, potato latkes, and the famous Snowden Deli party sandwiches. That's the Snowden Delicatessen. Let's talk a little bit a big picture, but locally big picture. We have a federal by-election coming up in a Marle-LaSalle Verdun, and all this, all the talk is about the fact that if the Liberals were to lose this after having lost St. Paul's and Toronto, that's kind of the end of the line as far as Justin Trudeau is concerned. How important is this riding for the Liberals to win?
I think it's critical to win. It is, I guess historically it's a riding that has, except for recently, has been hard fought. I think Dave would also say to you, my outgoing MP and former Justice Minister David Lametti, who's a close friend of mine, would say that he fought hard for it. But he got some really good margins based on his track record, based on the Liberal Party's track record, which would lead some people to say we should take it for granted. We don't. I've been doing door-to-door in my free time. We have a lot of people pulling all the stops. I think we will win it. But by-elections are they're interesting animals insofar as they're usually an indictment of the sitting government. So we have, and governments before us have lost what they consider to be strongholds. I don't think we should lose it. I'm not leaving anything on the table, so it won't be for lack of effort. But it's closer than. No, let's be honest. It's closer than we would wish. These ridings, and my riding's right beside it, so I understand some of the communities and the community dynamics. They are. They can be 3, even 4-way races between us, the Bloc.
This is 91-way races, I understand. There are 91 names on the ballot.
And that's just silliness for some Democratic Reform folks that, whatever their point of view, legitimate or not, have stuffed ballots with a bunch of people. But again, Aaron, I don't think any result is one that is a death knell for anything. But I do think we have to make the effort.
And it's critical. Your word is critical.
Oh, it's absolutely critical.
But the situation is exacerbated more by the fact that Mr. Singh just announced that he is no longer going to be party to any Liberal government staying in power. So that's got to raise issues with all of you within, and I mean the future of the party, because if he goes and an election comes much sooner than anybody had anticipated. People are talking about a Kamala move here. Change perhaps would be the only way to keep the Liberals going, but I got to think that these are tough times.
Yeah, and the
polls of
the agreement we had with the NDP was interesting. It's provided us with the longest, except for one historical quirk, the longest minority in Canadian history.
Right.
So it's been productive. The NDP has been able to move forward elements that we share in common, that we agreed to under the document. But it's not like it was a blank check or a guarantee that they would always vote with us on every issue. Was a slog,
right.
Whether it was in the agreement or not, or whether one particular MP in their party got worked up and decided that they were going to not vote for it. The NDP is a product of their individual members, and because they're so few in the House of Commons, the voices of the individual members are magnified, and not all of them were enthused by that agreement. So every single decision point where they were voting with us pretty much was a slog, and it's going to be a slog from a difficult challenge. It's going to be a battle here on in, but there's a particular political message behind Jagmeet Singh's statement, and whether it resonates or not is up to people to decide. But as a practical person that has to move forward the agenda of the government, I don't think it's business as usual, but it's not like we had a blank check in the first place, or no questions asked from the NDP. They did fight hard for every issue, so it'll be no different.
Did you have an idea there's a question now as to who knew this was coming, because 2 days before that, Pierre Poilievre went ahead and called Salvador Singh, and they should end the supply confidence agreement. It's almost as if the Conservatives might have known. Did the Liberals, did you know this was coming?
I think people suspected that the political value of these documents and understandings diminish as time goes on. I don't think most reasonable people saw it going much past December. I don't know of anyone who had a big heads up on this, and it sounds like the NDP had been preparing this for a couple of weeks. If you believe the people that said the video was done 2 weeks ago, but
right.
I'd say it's unfortunate that Jagmeet Singh was bullied by Pierre Poilievre, because the trust level with the NDP is thin on a good day. They paved the way for Stephen Harper, if you recall, and jettisoned the Kelowna Accords. So I don't think we need a History 2.0 coming up on this one and paving the way for Pierre Poilievre, who has not, in my mind, is a particular character we haven't seen in Canadian politics, and hasn't proposed any particular...
I think it's more a case of Mr. Singh is fighting for his political life, and as is the NDP in these two by-elections. If they manage to hold the one in Manitoba and make inroads here, might make a statement that would help in the long term. And I think he's putting everything on that level to kind of keep going. But
yeah,
otherwise it doesn't look
could
good.
be. I mean, we do share a number of things in common. We don't agree on a number of others, and these political alliances, they are not greater than the sum of their parts. They're often the opposite, because electors have a spectrum of things that they care about, and some person that you might peg as a conservative often has some very important liberal values that you would ascribe to the Liberal government, and then vice versa, and they don't necessarily move towards the NDP. We've seen that with the NDP when they've backtracked on gun control, when they've backtracked on environmental issues like the price on carbon, because some of their local MPs are under fire for having supported it. And so, you see some of the Western elements of the NDP under pressure, and I think that plays into the mix of a decision to sort of, in a dramatic fashion, tear up an agreement.
Right.
You heard Pierre Poilievre during the week, and I guess this will be the mantra going forward. He calls it the carbon tax election, the carbon tax election. From your point of view, what's the next election going to be about?
I think anyone that tells you for certain, Aaron, is probably full of it. These things tend to be surprises, even when you try to predict what the top 3 or 4 issues will be. I think Pierre Poilievre, for all his slogans, thinks that getting rid of the carbon tax will get him into power. It's a lot more complex than that, but he's a guy that likes to reduce things to simple concepts and sloganeer. But I think the themes that we talked about earlier, immigration will certainly be a top issue. I think when you look at the youth that are voting for the first time, there's a lot of concern about the environment, so that'll still be important. I think that'll backfire on the Conservatives that have no particular care for the economy. Affordability will still be an important issue. And there's probably a couple other more that we haven't predicted. I think the ranking of those within the election and what comes up in debates is uncertain, but I think those would be the high notes.
So in the event that, and I don't want to say that the Liberal Party is splintering, but there have been some notable, if you will, people anyway in the news. Jeremy Broadhurst leaving as Director of Communications, story this week. You have Pablo Rodriguez apparently interested. We keep hearing about running provincially and leaving Liberals here. In the event that Justin Trudeau wasn't going to be there, was going to make that decision to pull a Joe Biden, your name has been brought up before, some potentially to lead the party. Is there any truth to that? Are you interested?
No. I've said quite clearly, not a chance in hell.
Oh, well, that's pretty clear.
Look, I love my job. I love what I'm doing. Maybe this is the way my brain is wired, but when I'm thinking about something else, I'm done. And that for me, that's
definitive. Not a chance in hell. Why so?
I've had the unique opportunity to see what his job looks like as a friend. We've been close for about actually 40 years to this day, pretty much, because we met in 1984 when we started high school together. So I know the impact that's had on him and his family. I've seen his daily routine. It's not something I want for me. I think the actual job of a minister is probably, in terms of volume, harder than that as a prime minister, but the emotional impact, the impact on family, the fact that you're constantly under scrutiny is not, and I'm, as much as I'm a public figure, I do like my private time, and there's an introverted part to me that loves anonymity, and anonymity is underrated.
You're right.
You're constantly exposed, and I think that changes you as a person, and so that it's weird because I'm a minister and I do have exposure and people know who I am, to say that the next step, or even if we consider that a next step, is completely ruled out. But it's not for me. I'd rather support someone who feels that they're the best option for Canada. And right now, for me, that's, despite this conversation, is the Prime Minister.
Right.
And I support him. I support him because I think he is the best option to defeating a guy who wants to destroy our country.
Well, you know him better than most, as you said. You've been friends forever. Do you think there's any chance that he decides between now and whenever the next election is that no, he will not lead the party into an election?
I don't. I see the fire in his belly. Humans go through periods of introspection where they wonder whether they should continue or what. That's obviously occurred. He's been quite publicly about that, but I have not seen this level of fire in his belly in a while. And I actually have seen, frankly, oddly considering the polls, within the party, a level of support, not unconditional, and there's some notable exceptions,
Sure.
but I have not. I would say a year ago there were more questions within caucus about levels of support, but people want to run through a wall for him. They want a reason, but they also want to see a level of change and transformation in the way business is being done, which is natural after 8 or 9 years. So that is important, because you're only as good as the support from your members and the party and Canadians. And this isn't, despite the popularity of the Prime Minister and the place that he's given to his own popularity as part of his mandate, this isn't about one person, it's about our country.
There's also been talk about an imminent cabinet change because of the situation at hand with people moving on and so forth. Given your druthers, if you couldn't do immigration, where would you like to end up? Assuming you want to stay on.
So I'm not going to answer that question. And I'm not. I'll be honest about not answering that. But I don't like, as an individual, unfinished business. Like, it just bugs me viscerally to leave business unfinished. It's the reasons I had that trepidation leaving Indigenous Affairs that I did for 4 years, because I cared about the relationships like I care about the relationships now, and I felt I left some unfinished business on the table, which it's natural for the position that you're in. Any position of leadership has that component to it. So I like consistency. So if I were advising the Prime Minister, I would say, please don't move Marc Miller, because he likes what he's doing. But the last person you listen to in a cabinet shuffle is the person in your cabinet shuffle. So that is what it is. But I absolutely want to continue.
As your friend Mr. Lametti will point out.
Yeah, I mean, I think Dave, he's on the show, so what he said stands. But Dave is a close personal friend of mine. He has been one of the more consequential ministers of justice.
I agree.
During his time, in what he's been able to achieve in this hyper media era with social media. He's been targeted for a bunch of things, I think unfairly, but what he's been able to achieve, I think, is remarkable. And he's a super bright mind, and I don't think we've necessarily had that in previous justice ministers.
So we have to wrap up. I will ask you, since you brought up David Lametti, and we had him as a guest here a while ago. I don't want to call it the waffling, but I'll use that for lack of a better term, on Bill 96 in Quebec and where the federal Liberals stand. It's kind of been forgotten now. Other issues have sort of risen to the fore. But if and when this does get to the Supreme Court, the challenges to Bill 96, will the federal government, from what you understand, be there to support it, the challenge against it?
Oh, there's absolutely no question that we'll be at the Supreme Court. That goes without saying. I mean, people that suggest otherwise certainly don't know the Justice Minister currently, or the Prime Minister for that matter. I think what we've been accused of in Quebec, and is probably a completely different podcast, is being perhaps too slow to react to issues that are very visceral to the identity of Montrealers, whether it's the English community or others. In this social media era, there's a premium on reacting quickly and almost viscerally, which we haven't had in the past.
Except for Anthony Housefather.
But yeah, and I mean, I think, and Anthony's a particular individual. A lot of respect for him. He has that liberty to speak that we've given him as a party member, but he's also not a cabinet minister, and he doesn't have cabinet discipline imposed upon him. I do think that, the current nature of politics, particularly with the Quebec government, is one where there is a premium on baiting the federal government and just blaming everything on Justin Trudeau, or blaming everything on federalists, and making this about national identity with a sovereignist flavor, and perhaps sovereignty independence by paper cut, which has been an approach that you've seen. But it's important not to get baited, and the Prime Minister, to his credit, is very good at taking his time to take a decision. But I don't think anyone should question his support of the Charter and his support for minority rights. And that's something he'll never hesitate to stand up for. I think he's been accused of that, and that's what people bank on when they constantly try to bait him. But for example, in my portfolio, when the Premier comes out of the CAQ Winter Caucus and says we're going to make immigration the number one issue for Justin Trudeau in the next year, clearly a form of baiting, and they see that as being able to pay off for them in any sort of next election that they're contemplating. So you see that on scale when it comes to Bill 21 that we've been quite clear about, and Bill 96. But again, the federal government constantly jumping on a soapbox every time an issue gets thrown at them, I think is counterproductive. And in my mind, we do have to be a little more reserved and allow it to play out a bit without compromising our values. So I think there's a fine line between being baited and being accused of being slow on an issue. But I don't think anyone should question the Prime Minister or the federal government's support for minorities.
I would just ask you, we live in a bit of a vacuum here sometimes, right? We deal with issues provincially, you're bringing up immigration. And then we began this by me saying, around the rest of the country, this is a big issue. Are you seeing this to be as big an issue everywhere
Immigration?
else? Yeah.
It's odd because, so yes and no. It is less evoked publicly by politicians, I would say. I was actually having a chat with the U.S. ambassador, and he said he's never been asked more about immigration than by the Quebec media, which is an interesting observation from a diplomat and an outsider. But it's an issue generally around the country, and the volumes that we're seeing are ones that Canadians, and even recent Canadians who we expect enough support from immigration to be high, are questioning themselves, sometimes with respect to their own diaspora. So it's not an issue that is simply the product of one politician. The politicians bringing it up and weaponizing it to their own political agenda is absolutely unhelpful. And I think we have to have a space in the country where we can have a rational conversation about, are our immigration levels too high? If they are, where do we go from there? And how do we have a discussion without sort of pointing the fingers and saying you're a racist for saying this or you're a bigot for saying that, but having that conversation that I have around any Christmas or Easter tale, any time where I meet my relatives and have to talk to my a close family member about an issue that they disagree with, or even my kids. So that's, I think, unfortunate when you have these issues weaponized for any political purpose. And I think Canadians don't want levels of government bickering with each other about these things. They just want us to get our acts together and sort it out. Immigration is, despite the fact the federal government gets pointed at constantly for having sort of 100% of the jurisdiction, it's a split jurisdiction that, when it comes to the services that immigrants fill and are contributing to, but also are putting a strain on, the responsibility of provinces to invest in housing, to invest
Sure.
in the healthcare system, to invest in teachers that we're not going to necessarily form here domestically, but we're desperately in need of to teach the next generation.
All right, we're going to have to leave it at that.
Just have a happy lunch with Mr. Robertster.
Yeah.
It'll be great. It'll be great.
Will you be speaking in English with Mr. Rovich? Or
We'll be speaking.
would you have to have that in
we'll
French?
Be speaking, we'll
In
be speaking
French.
Will you
Okay.
bring some Tums with you too?
So we'll be,
Want to thank you for taking the time. Appreciate it.
thanks.
Minister Miller, we're going to catch you again here soon from the Snowden Deli, next time on the Corner Booth Podcast. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.